Proceeding quite slowly and leisurely and rightfully thoughtful this morning, we're going to do two things at once. We're going to learn to think properly, to use our minds rightly in an elementary way. And it's necessary for us to attend the first grade before we go on to the second or third. So we're going to be in the first grade by learning to think clearly toward a particular subject. So we're going to learn to think toward a particular subject. The subject being false and true pleasure. We're going to explore it, look at it, see what we've got. We won't understand it thoroughly, we'll understand the words, but there's so much involved in it, in false and true pleasure, which we'll see as we go along. All right, we have the subject, false and true pleasure. We're going to think first of all about false pleasure. What is it? What does that mean? You have the word false pleasure. Now, if we're going to think logically toward this, helping ourselves by thinking rightly, we can think that false pleasure would be, for example, wanting to feel a victory over you. We had that last night. False pleasure can be feeling protected by another human being. Feeling protected by having a system of religious or philosophical thought. That's a false pleasure. Look where we are already. We're at the point where we don't see that it's a false pleasure, do we? Otherwise, we wouldn't be involved in it. Okay, what else about a false pleasure? We call it good because it supplies us with security. We call it good, but now we can reason a little bit and see that it's not really good, though we've called it good, because it destroys me. It keeps me in conflict. It keeps me in the state where I have to prove my doctrine to you. I have to prove that I'm right, that I know what I'm talking about. And I get a false pleasure out of preaching to you, out of defending my so-called convictions and opinions. I get a great deal of pleasure because while I'm in the thought that I am right, I don't have to face the fact that I might be wrong. I'm so busy proving myself right, which is impossible, that for the moment I'm protected, in quote marks, from actually seeing that I'm wrong, which would give me a shock, which would frighten me, which would make me feel lost. So false pleasure is anything that keeps me divided from who I really am. And who am I? We can say that in many ways, and I'll say several of them. I'm sure you're adding your own. I am nothing at all except in the physical body, a particular representation in the physical form of the whole, capital W-H-O-L-E. That's what I am. That's what my physical body is. But I am not that physical body at all, and it's a false pleasure to think so, because now I think that I have a separate body. I think that I have a separate ego, a separate individuality. And when I think that, then I'm in conflict with you, or I want to take you in order to prove that I am who I imagine I am. False pleasure. Most people on earth live in false pleasure without knowing, again, what they do to themselves. Can I see myself in a situation, listen to this word, Can I see myself in a situation where I am behaving unnaturally? I was observing one particular member of this group. I referred to it yesterday, come into this room unnaturally, which means that this particular individual was in tension, apart from himself. Let's stick with this for a minute. Can I watch myself right now, and I'm going to ask you all to turn your attention back on yourself right now, physically, any way you want. Just look at yourself for a minute and see if you can detect any unnaturalness at all. Don't say, I don't see any. Look at it. That means that certain thoughts that are protecting me, so I think, are in action instead of sitting here in understanding. Do it when you're alone and try to see what is meant by unnatural behavior when you're all alone. Example, running the mental movie through your mind where you're the star of the show, where you're the martyr, where you're the victim, where you're anything at all that gives you a false feeling of life. Catch it. And we said last night, you're going to have to fight very hard for yourself, and that is what fighting consists of. Catching yourself right in the middle of a strained, unnatural, hostile, antagonistic mood, bawling someone out in your mind. Have you ever done that? Have you ever bawled someone else out in your mind? That is what is known as false pleasure. Which leads us to what comes next. If there's no false pleasure, what is there? What is there? Then there's something which there has no need to be called pleasure at all, because it's a state in which you are not calling anything pleasurable or unpleasurable, which is a state above thought which divides itself into opposites, but we're not calling it pleasurable or unpleasurable. Then, in this higher state, I've risen above the idea of pleasure and unpleasure, have I not? In this higher state, how am I going to meet life? We had an example of this 10 minutes ago in one of the little short talks. How am I going to meet life? With an absence of a demand to get a certain sensation from the event. Sensation of any kind, what would it be? Feeling superior to someone? Or feeling that, again, that I'm protected by someone? How many of you feel, let's get into that for a minute. How many of you feel that you're protected in some way, psychologically, not physically? The policeman will protect you physically. How many of you feel protected by an association with another human being? May I see your hands? Those of you listening to this tape, do you feel protected by a relative, someone living in your home? And for heaven's sake, do you feel protected by that club you belong to? That association? That group you go to? You feel protected by them? Haven't you studied the faces of the people in that group with you? And can you very honestly see what that facial expression means? And then, do you know what it means for the blind to follow the blind? Also, those of you listening to this tape, and those of you in this room, do you have a false pleasure out of having a hero, an idol? Oh. How about Christ being your idol, your hero? How about some other religious person, religious teacher who has great fame, whether living or not living? That person being your idol, and it gives you a sense of being protected, which means you have abandoned the mind that God gave you to work with in order to find God. Truth has given us the raw materials, and we waste it in wanting to feel secure. And have you noticed that it never works? How many of you feel insecure? May I see your hand? Insecure. I will tell you, I'm telling you this is a fact. Of course, all of you could have raised your hand. I will tell you as a fact, you can reach a point where there's no feeling of insecurity, whatever. None at all. Right in the middle of this mad world, where you work to earn your daily bread and put a roof over your head, but there's no emotional insecurity at all, because you're not there. Because you have seen through the delusion of false pleasure. Oh, I have to stop here, because I just thought of something. The false pleasure of arguing, either outwardly or inwardly. Isn't that nice, in quote marks, to argue with someone? Can you give that up right now? Just drop it. Just stop it. And see what a tremendous shock it gives to your psychic system. Just to stop arguing right, and the best time to do it is right when you're about to win the argument, so-called win. You're about to pounce. You get out a little piece of paper that proves you were right and the other person was wrong. Do you have the courage, in fear and trembling, to take that piece of paper and set it down and not get the ego thrill of winning over the other person, so that for the first time in your life you can behave decently toward that other person, regardless of how egotistical or cruel he is to you? So for the first time in your life, you see what it means to have a conscience. That shock will do something for you if you can find and should find enough places to give it to yourself. You're in a room with a lot of other people, and it's an open discussion of some kind. You're sitting there quietly observing yourself in relation to them, and they're talking about some subject which they don't know much about. But it just so happens that you happen to know something about it. You're a real authority. You know how to bake cookies. How's that for an authority? And they don't know how to bake cherry cookies. We'll make it more specific. And you know how to bake cherry cookies. They don't know. Now I'm someone. I can tell you that you buy maraschino cherries, and if you buy the big box, can, bottle, it saves you money, and you mix them with coconut. And for the false pleasure of being an expert on cherry cookies, and they did not want to know that much about cherry cookies. Anyway, you or me have sold our soul for 15 minutes of blab in order to feel that I am someone and you are not, because I know all about cherry cookies and you don't. Now, the topic comes up about baking cherry cookies. And you don't do it. You don't say it. Oh, the agony you're going to go through. Oh. Boy. You don't get very many moments in life to really be someone. You deliberately rob yourself of the false pleasure of being the blabbermouthery authority. You deliberately, and you shock yourself like you've never done before. I will come over and shake your hand if you do this and say, sir or madam, you are really carrying out the work into everyday life. You're robbing yourself of false pleasure. You're knowing what it means to die psychologically. You know what it means to at last be on the track of truth and of being in the state of inner transformation. Believe it or not, when I do something like this, the shock I receive is true pleasure. A small part of me senses its rightness, and that is true pleasure. Have you ever had the experience of doing something really right and noticing the right feeling it gave you? If you've ever done anything right. But this is very tricky, isn't it? You do understand, do you not, how at every turn on this path we can deceive ourselves and lie to ourselves? It is very important to remember at all times. Otherwise, I'll think I have a truly right feeling, and it will simply be a masquerade for keeping the stage performer in place. All right, true pleasure. We're still thinking logically. I don't have to work and must not work with the motive of attaining true pleasure. Because I'll deceive myself into thinking, for example, that now that I am religious, I now have the pleasure of being able to talk to God in prayers, which is self-deception. If I can see through the deception and the false practice of talking to God, which I call talking to God, if that falls away, then at least in one small area, I will have the true pleasure of not being in agonizing self-deception of trying to get God to do something for me. Never mind if what he does for me hurts you. God give me the promotion instead of Bill. When I go through all this, authentic pleasure is there, which is simply a state of not being in an unnatural state anymore. The absence of the false, right? The absence of the false means the existence of the truth. And there it is. And there I am, right in the middle of it, without any need to say, how am I going to find pleasure? How's this for a sentence? But it gets the point over. God, truth, Reality is authentic pleasure.